Hi everybody, welcome back to the embellishing class. I hope everyone has been posting their project as we go along. I want you to get in on the action for winning the sample quilt. This is going to be our final lesson, so be sure and post and get your name in the drawing to win this quilt. Boy, our quilts are starting to look really great. It's getting so exciting. This is what your quilt should look like now that you've completed all of your hand stitching. You've done your raw edge applique, you've done machine stitching and metallic thread stitching, couching, all kinds of great stuff. But there is so much to cover today. It's just crazy. We've got our beads, our sequins, buttons. It's sort of like the cherry on top with 5,000 cherries. So the way I'm going to start is explain to you that I've only used two very basic bead embroidery stitches. I'm going to show you what those stitches are, and then I'll show you on the quilt where those stitches happen. So let's talk about some of the tools we'll be using first. I've got a display here of several kinds of sequins and beads. Now these are only things that we've used on our sample quilt. There's so much more. There's large sequin flowers, teeny tiny sequin flowers. We've got some different circles. This is kind of a starburst flower and it's got a hologram finish on it, so it's real shiny and blingy. It's wonderful on your quilts. Just keep in mind when you're walking past the booth that has the beads and the sequins at the quilt show that it might have the perfect item for your next quilt. You know, here's just a simple button. We've got some decorative beads. These beads that are sort of a long straw are called bugle beads, and they come in all different finishes and all different lengths as well. And then our simple round beads are called seed beads, and those come in a whole bunch of different sizes too. Sizes, colors, finishes. So those are some of the bead and sequin tools that we'll be using this week. Also important tools that we'll be using is you'll want to make sure that you have a beading needle. It's a very thin needle and it has a small eye so that it can accommodate your thread passing through the tiny little holes in your beads. The thread that I like the best to use for bead embroidery is called silicone. And it actually was engineered for the upholstery industry. It's very strong, and the reason I like silicone brand is that it's pre-waxed. The silicone thread that's in the companion packs comes on a card like this, but if you want a larger quantity you can also buy spools of silicone thread. Because it's pre-waxed, it doesn't tangle as easily. When you take it off of the card, let's see, hopefully this will show on the camera. It kind of has like a kink pattern in it from being wrapped around the card because of the pre-wax. If you give the thread a little tug, all of those kinks will just sort of magically come out, and you've got a really smooth thread with the pre-waxing on it. It's sort of like using Thread Heaven or something, but it's already on there. So and then I like to have a little scoop. You can find little bead scoops at your local craft store, and they're really inexpensive, but they're kind of handy for corralling beads and tidying up, scooping them around and getting them back into their containers. This is a really great find. It's a long pair of tweezers with the little scoop at one end. So it sort of is a two-in-one tool. Okay, so where do we start with our bead embroidery? One of my very most favorite, really visually effective stitches is called a stack stitch. And the reason it's called a stack is because you're going to stack several elements. You could stack 2 or more beads, or you can stack sequins and then beads. So let me just show you a simple stack using sequins and beads. I'm just going to show you on muslin because I think it will show up better. And I'm using a red silicone thread, hoping that you'll be able to see that, but you really don't want to see it on your quilt. So when I'm using one on a quilt, I use this sort of medium gray because it fades into the sort of the shadows and the cracks. All right, so I've got my needle threaded, and it's a double thread. I like to have just a little extra insurance policy with my beads on there. So the same way we did with our our hand stitches, you're going to come in through the back of your quilt sandwich and pop that little thread into the body of your quilt where you'd like your stack stitch to occur. In this case, let me just show you a couple of stacks right before we start. This is what I'm talking about. I'm going to start with a large flower sequin, and then put a circle sequin on top of it, and then end with a bead. And when you finish your stack, you end up with an element that, an element that looks like this. It's a stack of sequins and beads. Okay, so let me show you how that works. I've got my needle threaded, and I'm going to pick up, oh, and let me talk about this, what I've got my beads on. This is a little piece of what's called Vlcek, and it's a very kind of weird blanket material. Sometimes in hotels you'll get a blanket like that. They're a little bit kind of creepy actually, but it's got a foam core in the middle, and then it has fibers that stick up going both directions. So your sequins and beads will set on it nicely, and they won't roll around. So if you wiggle it a little bit, they're not rolling off of the table and falling off. It's a really nice surface to have when you're doing beading. All right, so I'm going to pick up a flower sequin, a circle sequin, or a round. Sometimes they're called round. And then I'm going to put one of these beads on top. I'll let that slide down my thread till it's on. Let's see if I can spread it out a little bit for you so that it's on my quilt. Now when I go back through these, I'm not going to go back through the last thing I added, because I need that to anchor everything else. So I skip that one. It's called a turnaround bead. And then I'm going to go back through my round sequin, back through my flower sequin, and into my quilt where I started. And then when I pull it, you'll see how that last bead holds everything together in a stack, and that's why it's called a stack. All right, the next bead embroidery stitch that I'm going to show you, I'm just going to come back up, travel through my quilt, and come up to where I want to do my next stitch. When you're sewing on your actual quilt, you're not going to want to travel with the same thread farther than an inch. If you have to go inside of your quilt farther than an inch, it's better to tie off where you are, pull that knot into your quilt sandwich, and then tie on again. Your beads will tend to get gappy or tend to sort of fall off, or else it might pucker up your quilt if you're trying to travel too much farther than that. All right, so now let me show you how to do a bugle stitch. The bugle bead is a long, skinny, it's sort of like a straw. And when they're made, the straw is extremely long, and then it's snapped off at different intervals to give you the length of the bead. So it's very rough on the edge. So when you stitch a bugle stitch, you need to pick up a seed bead on either end of the bugle. So I'm going to pick up a seed bead, then I'm going to pick up my bugle, and then I'm going to pick up another seed bead. And that protects your thread from the rough edge of the bugle at either end. Now, when you're going back into your quilt, you want to make sure that you've scooched your beads to the end of the thread so that they lay nice and flat, and then you're going to go straight in at the edge of that final bead. And that is a bugle stitch. So then you would travel inside your quilt sandwich and come out where you want your next bugle stitch to be. So I'm picking up a seed bead, I'm picking up a bugle, and I'm picking up a seed bead. All right, and then you can scoot all of the beads up to where you want to snug them up on that stitch, and then enter straight in. Pull my thread in. Got a little fuzzy there. Okay, so that's 2 bugle stitches, and you can begin to sort of fan them out. I'll show you on the quilt in just a minute. I sort of fanned them out to give them a little bit of a cloud look on our sample. So let's scoot over and just look at a couple different samples of how I've made just two bead embroidery stitches look so different on this quilt. Up here, I've got the starburst stacked with a round bead and 2 other beads. And then coming down the quilt, we've got the little flower stack that I just showed you in a sample down in our long grass area. Over on the other corner of the quilt, this is a very simple stack. It's just 1 sequin and 1 bead, and it kind of gives the leaf a little stylized look. On our buds, we've got the teeny tiny flower sequin with 1 seed bead on them, and it just makes the buds look, you know, it gives them a fun little sparky flavor. Here I've got some simple stacks on top of the tulip stamens. And then really, just for fun and because I hate to stitch around those teeny tiny circles, I dotted the eye on my quilt message with sequins and a bead. Just above that, you can see what I was talking about with the bugle stitches. I've sort of fanned them out to make them look like a little striated cloud in the sky. And then the other place where I've used the bugle stitch on here is way down at the bottom. On one of our leaves, I've just used bugle stitches to give it a little bit of a stylized look. So really, your creativity is the limit. You can add these stitches like crazy all over the place. The one last little thing that I want to touch on is really not a bead stitch at all. But do you remember from our lesson 1 when we were doing our raw edge applique and our words on fabric? If you remember, you had made a little piece of twill tape with the message love on it. Well, the message on my quilt is quilting equals love, and here's our little word love. So and I've just peeled it right off of the paper out of my printer. I'm going to give it a fun little, just clip the edge so that it's, you know, cuter than the raw edge of the twill tape. Just give it a little V in there. And then the way I attach this onto my quilt is by sewing a button on top of it. So I would just sew through that with my Silamide thread the way you'd ordinarily attach a button, but to make it really fun, and if you want to get exciting with some of the stuff that you've learned in this class, go back to last week, pull out some of your decorative threads. Let's go back over to the sample. And I've done stitches from the outside of the button into the hole rather than just in the interior to give it a little bit more of a decorative flair. And then these tiny little seed stacks around the edge, you know, give it a fun little decorative center. So that's a lot. That's a lot of cherries on top, but that's really fun. To me, this is the super fun part. You don't want to pour out thousands and thousands of beads onto your table all at once, because sure enough, you know, your dog's going to run by or your husband's going to bump the table. So just do a couple that you're working on and then move on to the rest. If you don't have a huge stash of beads, you might want to think about getting the companion pack for the quilt. I have all of the types of sequins and all of the seed beads and bugle beads and the Silamide thread in that companion pack if you're interested in that. Boy, I mean, this has been a fantastic project, and I hope that you all worked on it at home along with me. I'm just super excited, and now that we're close to the holidays, you might even think about a special quilter that you have in your life that this would be a perfect gift for. It's hard to say goodbye. I've had so much fun with TQS, but we've made a fantastic quilt, and I hope everyone out there has really enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you so much.